One day when I was very young, I was playing in the living room as my dad came home from work. I'd watch him come through the front door pretty much every day, but for whatever reason, this was the first time I really saw him. Despite witnessing this same routine hundreds of times at this point, I never noticed before just how somber and exhausted he looked after a day at the office. And so, wanting to make things better, I told him something that most adults would say to me whenever I was feeling down. I asked him, "Did you have fun?" He stopped for a moment, and what he said next I'll never forget. He looked me in the eyes and told me, "No, son, jobs aren't made for us to have fun." And that was the day I figured out that people don't like going to work.
No. Wrong. It's come to my attention that you're not measuring up. You'll need to stay late. Again. With no overtime. Your project has to be completely redone. You can't seem to do anything right. Oh, I'm going to have to write you up again, too. You're just not measuring up. That's 3 more demerits this week. Did you get the memo about the pay cut? 10% across the board. We've got to cut back. It's the bottom line, you see.
Years later, my dad showed me a movie, one that he related to very much. And although I really didn't understand what was going on most of the time, I remember being somewhat entertained. I didn't think much of it besides that, but as the years went by, this movie just kept sticking in my memory. Every now and then I would watch it again, and the more I watched it, the more its meaning started to change. As I got older, I started to realize that I was no longer watching a film. I was watching a prophecy. The year 1999 shows up in my work over and over again. This wasn't by design, but by now it has to feel like an oddly personal obsession. What is it about this specific year that I've found to be so compelling? The answer is difficult to put into words. If I had to boil it down to one thing, I'd compare it to the sensation of standing over a precipice. It's an ominous feeling to consider what exactly awaits us on the other side. It turns out that plenty of ominous events can be found in 1999, both in reality and fiction. According to IMDb, the 2 most critically acclaimed films of 1999 are Fight Club and The Matrix, both of which happen to feature characters who grapple with an artificial reality. But when it comes to instilling existential dread, 1999 produced another movie which I personally found to be more frightening. This is a video about the most influential film of my life. On the surface, it's a straightforward comedy about the white-collar workplace. While many know the film for its memorable dialogue and eccentric characters, its true importance extends far, far beyond that. This is the story of Peter Gibbons, a computer programmer who's average in just about every way. He's responsible, stays out of trouble, and more or less does what he's told. He tries his best to lead a sensible life. He has a decent car, decent apartment, and decent relationships with his friends. This is all to suggest that nothing about Peter is especially strange or abnormal. By all accounts, he's a model citizen of 20th century America. Except for one problem. He is absolutely miserable.
So I was sitting in my cubicle today and I realized ever since I started working, every single day of my life has been worse than the day before it.
We're told that this shouldn't be possible. How the privileges afforded to white-collar Americans are supposed to indicate the end state of history. Peter's lot in life is not just fortunate, it's the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. Modern office workers are given luxuries that would have been unimaginable to most people who ever lived. The ability to operate in a climate-controlled space with practically zero risk of danger or bodily injury, where the only effort you have to physically exert is tapping away at a magic machine with access to limitless possibilities. You'd think that someone blessed with these modern marvels would be thrilled, or at the very least ambivalent, but on the contrary, Peter Gibbons actively dreads going to work each day. How can this be the case? A job like Peter's is the crowning achievement of society. Think about all the suffering and ideological warfare it took for such a thing to be possible. Forget the Cold War. This job is the direct product of 10,000 years of civilization. This is everything, and you're telling me that you don't like it? How dare you? Well, let's ask Mike Judge how. In 1987, a young engineer in Silicon Valley is having second thoughts about his career path. Just 3 months into the job, he quits to go pursue something a little more enticing. After touring with a band for a couple years, he eventually settles on the emerging field of animation. His early cartoons are quite rudimentary, but through the crude lines and voices, a clear vision begins to emerge. It's not hard to tell that Mike Judge has a somewhat cynical view of society. His works paint a dysfunctional picture of the modern world, one that is defined primarily by the incongruence of modern people. This theme is evident in Judge's first major breakthrough, Beavis and Butthead, a comedy that perfectly captured the growing angst of unruly teenagers.
You're working.
The dynamic of the show can best be described as two irrational people antagonizing a rational world. Judge's next series, King of the Hill, flips this dynamic on its head, where the main character Hank resembles a rational man dealing with an irrational world. Both of these cartoons would go on to see extraordinary success, as Judge ascended to a hot commodity in the entertainment industry. After the success of the Beavis and Butthead feature film, he was given the opportunity to direct another movie, one that features a rational man trapped in an irrational world. The project sought to further develop a prior animated short about an oddball office worker named Milton. It would be Judge's first foray into live-action directing, and soon enough, the once silly premise transformed into something far more bold. Eventually, the decision was made to have the main conflict of the film center around a protagonist who hates his job. It's difficult to understate how risky this idea was in the late 90s. America has always had a strong work culture, and for generations it was considered taboo to complain about your lot in life, especially if you were fortunate enough to work in an office. People have to be able to relate to a film's main character, and a premise like this could have easily come off as whiny and entitled. At first, Judge's ambition appeared to have backfired, as the film's theatrical release was a financial disappointment. However, over the next few years, something about it started to catch on. After a few airings on television, Office Space saw a remarkable rise in popularity, most notably among the very workers it satirized. It turned out that Judge had succeeded in making a relatable product. It was so relatable, in fact, that it seemed to produce a hypnotic effect in certain people. Depending on your place in the world, the appeal of the film went far beyond a simple cult following. For white-collar workers, Office Space represented a spiritual awakening. It communicated something that was previously unspoken. The film presents the audience with a seemingly straightforward question. If an average, well-adjusted man decides that he never wants to work again, what exactly is wrong with him? Answering this is no easy task. It forces us to examine who we really are as human beings. This type of truth-seeking can prove quite dangerous, as many of us won't like what there is to be found. The most depressed I've ever been was during my first semester of college, when I realized that my life was turning into Peter's. I felt like I was stuck on a conveyor belt that was carrying me towards an office. That had always been my destination, but at some point, my focus shifted to everything else that was passing me by. I was suddenly overcome with this inescapable sense of disillusionment, as if everything I had known was just one big lie. I never made it to that office, and ever since then, I've been trying to figure out what about it filled me with so much dread. Whenever you question the modern labor system, you're usually met with one of two responses. The first is that conditions are significantly better today than they were in the past, and the second is that if you don't like your job, you're free to seek employment somewhere else. These are some pretty cheerful things to tell ourselves, but something about it doesn't add up. So many people in modern society are profoundly miserable, and as the rates of depression and anxiety continue to soar higher and higher, you have to wonder if there's something seriously wrong with how most of us spend our waking hours. If you think about it long enough, you start to toy around with the possibility that many of us might be better off if we stopped going to work altogether.
God, I've had to work hard every day of my life, and what do I have to show for it?
As soon as you bring up this idea, others are quick to dismiss it as either selfish entitlement or communist propaganda. But the true gravity of the question goes far beyond a matter of political disagreement. It starts to venture into the realm of sociology, confronting the very foundations of human behavior. For most of industrial society, we have lacked the knowledge to even adequately address what's being asked here. This was largely a consequence of us understanding economics before understanding ourselves. If you ever feel like you're living a lie, it's worth revisiting the inventor of the biggest lie, Thomas Hobbes, a philosopher who lived about 400 years ago. While attempting to argue for the necessity of authoritarianism, he sought to define the natural state of ungoverned men. It was here, under no scientific basis, that Hobbes proclaimed the lives of archaic humans to be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. This quotation would go on to be one of the most reproduced lines in the English language, and its influence on society can still be felt today. Hobbes' theory stood unchallenged for centuries as a grand, all-encompassing thesis for the purpose of civilization. When millions of people today wake up at the crack of dawn and sit in bumper-to-bumper traffic to get to a job they hate, they tell themselves, this may be bad, but think about how much worse it would be if none of this stuff existed. It was only through recent strides in anthropology that we realized the foundation of modern politics and economics was dead wrong.
I believe that as a species, human beings define their reality through misery and suffering, which is why the Matrix was redesigned to this, the peak of your civilization.
In The Matrix, Agent Smith describes the year 1999 as the peak of civilization. But is civilization necessarily the peak of humanity? The entirety of written history constitutes roughly 2% of mankind's total existence. While nearly all political discussion is confined to this narrow slice, not many of us bother to venture into the other 98%, which is otherwise known as prehistory. This time span represents about 10,000 generations of human beings who spent their lives as hunter-gatherers. They lived in tribes of up to 150 people and subsisted off the plants and animals that nature provided them. Contrary to what much of the modern world believes, they weren't constantly starving and trying to murder each other. In fact, there's ample evidence to suggest that their lives were relatively peaceful and comfortable. We know this because, for as much as modern society has tried to erase them, there are still a few of these tribes left. They can be found all around the world, from jungles to deserts to frozen tundra. Despite having no means of communicating with each other, they share some remarkably similar behavior. Present-day hunter-gatherers tend to have three universal characteristics. The first is a harmonious relationship with nature and other people. They possess a deep reverence and gratitude for the world around them, which is often expressed through a powerful sense of spirituality. The second characteristic is mobility. Tribal groups move along with the flow of resources, meaning that they're never confined to a fixed location. This nomadic lifestyle offers little use for private property or any sort of excess in material goods. In addition to the tribe itself, individual members also have freedom of movement and can easily join neighboring clans whenever they wish. The third characteristic is a strict respect for personal autonomy. Hunter-gatherers live in egalitarian societies which lack any sort of formal hierarchy. Individuals are free to operate as they please, as long as they're not actively jeopardizing the overall community. Anything requested out of people is done so under their own volition. This is a lot to swallow if you're hearing it for the first time, but this knowledge is important because it offers us insight into the blueprints of humanity. It's easy to be skeptical about the merit of our distant ancestors. Many today like to facetiously refer to them as noble savages. And while I'm not trying to argue that their lives were necessarily better than ours, there's a conversation to be had about how modern civilization is more of a trade-off than we'd often like to admit. In other words, there is a price to progress. Every day, the modern world drags us further from the baseline conditions we're adapted for, and the more we stray off the reservation, the more problems we're likely to encounter.
You know, I'm thinking about getting out, Marlon.
Yeah? Out of what? Out of my job.
What the hell's wrong with your job? You have a great job, Truman. You have a desk job.
Stop me if you've heard this one before. You see a friend going through a rough time and they say something along the lines of, "I wish I could just leave everything behind and go live in a small house in the woods." There is an increasing desire among modern people to return to some older, simpler way of life. In Office Space, Peter states that if he had $1 million, he would choose to do nothing.
I would relax. I would sit on my ass all day. I would do nothing.
It's a funny line the first time you hear it, but deep down there's an oddly zen quality to such an idea. Out of all the methods to appraise the prosperity of a society, we often fixate on measures of material wealth, education, and technology. But if you really think about it, the most fortunate people are defined by their ability to sit around all day doing nothing. By this metric, most of us are far less prosperous than our prehistoric ancestors. Out of all the hunter-gatherer tribes ever studied, it's rare to see anyone work more than 3 to 4 hours per day. Some tribes don't even have a word for work, at least not in the way we define it. The day-to-day responsibilities of foraging cultures are not treated as grueling toil. Rather, they are voluntary social activities that more closely resemble what we know as games. This carefree approach to life certainly opens up a lot more time to do nothing. Of course, when people say they want to do nothing, they're not talking about staring at a wall like a statue. They're describing the concept of leisure, something that only seems to be getting more scarce in modern times.
I'm gonna need you to go ahead and come in tomorrow.
In Office Space, Peter is overworked, and his job is constantly encroaching on what little free time he has left. This is the essential struggle that plagues all modern workers. When you go to work and collect a paycheck, the process can more accurately be described as selling your time. If you're a productive worker, it's in the corporation's interest to extract as much time out of you as possible. That's good for the economy, but not so good for the people who serve it. We have now entered uncharted waters in terms of how much time people spend wishing they were doing something else. In 1987, sociologist Juliet Shore compared the annual labor output of American workers and medieval peasants, and found that we are working about 300 hours longer. This estimate is non-scientific and doesn't take into account the sheer difficulty of effort, but still, when it comes to the historic class known for being the poster child of backbreaking labor, it's disturbing how we're even in the same conversation. The average American can now expect to spend 90,000 hours at work during their lifetimes, or about 1/3 of your waking hours as an adult. It's now common for some folks to spend more time with their coworkers than the people they actually care about. We accept this as normality because we've never known any other way, but our intuition tells us that something about the whole thing is deeply wrong. It wasn't supposed to turn out this way, according to the most influential economist of the past century. In 1930, John Maynard Keynes predicted that in a few generations, people would have to work just 15 hours per week. He reasoned that advancements in technology would drastically increase economic efficiency. The average worker would therefore require far less time to maintain their level of productivity. Such a scenario would have provided us with roughly as much leisure time as hunter-gatherers enjoyed. And yet, after technology and economic output have very much soared, people are still working as much as ever. Well, in that case, surely the record-breaking productivity of the workforce must be reflected in booming wages. Somehow, this is also not the case. It would seem that we're sacrificing quite a lot these days for the privilege of going to work. With all that in mind, you'd think that people must really love their jobs. The moment Peter walks through the front door at Initech, he is assaulted by a non-stop barrage of aggravation. The office is a hostile and oppressive landscape filled with unnerving sights and sounds. The technology he depends on is often dysfunctional, resulting in frequent delays and setbacks. Most of his coworkers make him uncomfortable with awkward and overbearing behavior. He is pestered all day by smug authority figures who constantly hover over his shoulder, the most relentless of which is his sworn enemy, Bill Lumbergh. We're told that Peter's official job is to update bank software for the upcoming Y2K bug, but we rarely ever get to see him do it. That's because he's often preoccupied with something far more meaningless.
We need to talk about your TPS reports.
The infamous TPS report isn't actually a real thing. Mike Judge made it up for the film, yet everyone knows exactly what it is. We've all experienced the same irrelevant busywork designed to chew up even more of your already bloated schedule. If the company's buying your time, they will make damn sure they end up using it. While trapped in a Russian prison camp, the legendary writer Fyodor Dostoevsky once tried to conceive of the worst possible method of torture. He surmised that the most psychologically destructive thing you could do to someone would be forcing them to repeat a pointless task over and over again until they go mad. At the end of the day, it's not the sweeping acts of cruelty that crush our spirits. It's the little things. Peter's situation is far from unique. As much as 80% of the workforce is dissatisfied with their job. As much as 50% considers their job to be pointless. But for as bleak as the situation may seem, Office Space provides us with an unorthodox solution.
Well, you don't need $1 million to do nothing, man. Take a look at my cousin. He's broke, don't do shit.
As far as we're concerned, the goal of a capitalist system is to maximize profits by minimizing effort. A capitalist is successful when they take home the most wealth. That much is obvious. However, equally successful is the capitalist who spends the least time working. After Peter sees his hypnotherapist keel over and die in front of him, he reaches an epiphany. He decides that he will succeed by doing nothing. The next morning, Peter doesn't show up for work.
I don't like my job, and I don't think I'm gonna go anymore.
He sleeps in, ignores Lumberg's phone calls, and asks out the girl he likes. Over the next few days, they watch movies and go fishing. Eventually, when he feels like it, he heads back to the office, but not to do his job. He shows up in street clothes, parks in Lumberg's spot, and gets to work on some solo projects. He fillets his dinner, plays some video games, and even does a little bit of interior redecorating. Lumberg's passive-aggressive comments are powerless to stop him.
Now, are you going to go ahead and have those TPS reports for us this afternoon?
No.
After just a few days of doing nothing, Peter has become ungovernable.
I did absolutely nothing, and it was everything that I thought it could be.
It turns out that plenty of companies are afraid of their workers doing nothing. If enough people join in, they just might have to treat them better. While all this has been going on, however, the rest of the office has taken a turn for the worse.
What would you say you do here?
Initech has hired a pair of overpaid consultants to trim the fat of the workforce. One by one, each of Peter's friends has to step into the lion's den and plead their case for why they deserve to keep their jobs. The ritual is sadistic and humiliating. The workers squirm and beg as they desperately try to spare themselves the indignity of getting laid off. This exercise serves as a harrowing reminder of the true power that the system holds over us.
What the hell is wrong with you people?
If you hate your job so much, why don't you just leave? Is an obvious response for the disgruntled worker. At face value, it seems like a reasonable question. We live in a free country with free markets, so what's the big deal? Why can't more people just do what Peter did? There's a new word in the lexicon. You may have heard of it. If you're finding a job to be increasingly menial and dehumanizing, then you just might be a wagey, a shorthand term to describe a wage slave. Through a conventional understanding, this concept may seem like an oxymoron. Getting compensated for your labor through a wage is strictly antithetical to the inherent nature of bondage. Western civilization certainly prides itself on abolishing slavery, although some would argue that it never really went away. Once the overlords of society could no longer own human beings, they had to get a little more creative at coercing labor out of people. Of course, there were always the age-old institutions that sort of, but not quite, resemble slavery. Serfdom, for example, forces peasants to work in exchange for the land they live on. Indentured servitude forces people to work for long periods of time until they pay off an outstanding debt. Ever since the Industrial Revolution, debt has been used as the primary instrument for keeping people busy. Coal mines were infamous for setting up company stores where employees were sold basic necessities on credit that they could not possibly repay with their wages. In the American South, The practice of debt bondage was used as a proxy to extend slave conditions well into the 1950s. Even in the present day, plenty of Americans are still defined by what they owe. As many as 1 in 4 Americans are estimated to have a negative net worth, meaning that they could not pay off their debt even if they sold everything they own. More than 1 in 3 are just treading water by living paycheck to paycheck, while an outright majority don't have enough cash to cover a $1,000 emergency. If anyone in these circumstances took even a month off work, they would suffer disastrous consequences. Their situation doesn't really leave them with much choice in the matter. The threat of bankruptcy is awfully persuasive at making people stick with even the most oppressive working conditions. Many will argue that debt and spending are volitional, and that people who mismanage their finances deserve what happens to them. I'd be more inclined to believe this if these problems didn't affect a majority of people you see on the street. There comes a point when a vice of society is so widespread that it can't be written off as incidental. If this much of the workforce is struggling, you have to consider whether it's a product of intentional design. If you think that receiving a paycheck waives your right to protest any sort of mistreatment, it's really worth considering the psychological effects that these conditions have on people. This goes far beyond the day-to-day stress and anxiety of a hostile environment. The modern workplace seems to evoke a profound sense of alienation, a sinking feeling that no one around will catch you when you fall. The most severe punishment that a prison can enforce on an inmate is placing them in solitary confinement, where they are completely cut off from any meaningful communication with others. Strangely enough, this terrible fate now seems to afflict plenty of people in the free world as well. In hunter-gatherer societies, being left alone was the equivalent of being left for dead. Human beings are not solitary creatures. We're designed to exist in a community that has our backs. Modern offices have no shortage of people, but the social fabric hardly resembles any sort of tribal unity.
Sounds like somebody's got a case of the Mondays.
The temperament of most workplaces today can more closely be described as every man for themselves. There's not much room for camaraderie when everyone knows they're only around to collect a paycheck. For some, this fake veneer of acquaintanceship is even more disquieting than literal loneliness. What good is being surrounded by others if you can't really trust any of them? Corporate structures desperately try to simulate real human connection with hollow messages of team building and being part of the company family. But deep down, everyone knows that when the opportunity presents itself, that so-called family will sell you out in a heartbeat. That's just business. It's nothing personal, and maybe that's precisely the problem.
Oh yeah, we're gonna bring in some entry-level graduates, farm some work out to Singapore, it's usual deal.
Peter's trip through Wonderland comes to an abrupt end when he finds out that his friends Michael and Samir are getting fired. Despite being competent, diligent workers, Initech is kicking them to the curb. In the same conversation, Peter learns that by doing nothing, he's being rewarded with a promotion.
So you're gonna fire Michael and Samir and you're gonna give me more money?
Out of everything he's dealt with, it's the sheer unfairness of it all that drives him over the edge. We all have a built-in desire for equity. This trait is so embedded in our instincts that it can even be observed in other primates. When it comes to the modern workplace, perhaps the biggest elephant in the room is the one at the top of the company ladder. As any business grows, so too does the gap separating the workers and the people in charge. In 1965, American CEOs earned about 20 times more than the average employee at the same company. In the present day, that ratio is now estimated to be at least 300 to 1. Many modern corporations have such bloated hierarchies that the top brass may never physically see the workers who actually produce what they're selling. All that distance between them has subsequently been filled with more and more convoluted tranches of middle management.
So that means that when I make a mistake, I have 8 different people coming by to tell me about it.
My dad worked as an engineer, and he would often complain to me about the human resources department at his office. Even though he was responsible for fulfilling the actual function of the business, the HR people got paid twice as much as him to basically schedule meetings and talk about synergy all day. In the modern economy, someone like Bill Lumbergh is just the tip of the iceberg. What's more accurate is a seemingly unending chain of Lumberghs, each micromanaging the one beneath them. I'm starting to see where all that money may have gone from the decades of record-setting productivity. With this in mind, you have to ask yourself how demoralizing it must be for the folks further down the pyramid. It can't be motivating to know that the fruits of your labor are not just paying the extravagant salary of the rich CEO you'll never meet, but also paying the stooges who browbeat you all day with TPS reports. It's not the mere existence of inequality that bothers people so much. It's the systematic nature of the whole thing. How the very basis of the economy seems to rely on you getting the short end of the stick. The expression "life's not fair" doesn't say the whole story. What it's really trying to tell us is that life is rigged.
I know, Michael. It's completely unfair. And I realized something today. It's not just about me and my dream of doing nothing. It's about all of us together.
There comes a point when a game gets so unfair that it's not even fun for the winners anymore. A lesser man would have accepted his hollow victory, but not Peter. He is simply too disgusted.
And you're going to go in tomorrow, they're going to throw you out on the street so that Bill Lumberg's stock will go up 1/4 of a point.
It's no longer enough to coexist alongside the system. When the soul of humanity is betrayed to this extent, strange things start to happen. So, you want to escape the rat race once and for all. Well, the third act of Office Space presents us with a few options of how to do so. The first method is to get horrifically injured in some kind of freak accident. This is what happens to Tom Smikowski, the worker at Initech who'd spent the longest time searching for salvation.
You see, that's what you have to do. You have to use your mind and come up with some really great idea like that, and you can make millions, never have to work again.
He had tried everything from entrepreneurship to suffocating himself in his garage, but what actually ended up working was getting T-boned by a drunk driver. The wreck earns him a big enough settlement that he never has to work again. Tom's in pretty bad shape, but he feels better than ever. This was the scene that took me the longest to understand. At face value, putting yourself in debilitating pain seems like a lousy trade-off for being relieved of your duties. I always thought it was quite a stretch for anyone to be so happy about it, until one day when I watched a YouTube video of a guy ranting about working at Walmart. There was a part that stuck out to me where he mentions dreading his job so much that he found himself wishing to get in a car accident on the way to work. In his mind, that would have been worth it to avoid just a single day of retail.
I did not want to go to work so badly, so miserable, that I wanted to get into a car accident so I didn't have to work.
This scenario is deeply unsettling, but it does reflect how many real people actually think. Modern studies increasingly show that emotional and physical pain are far more interchangeable than we once thought. Perhaps a single agonizing injury really is preferable to a continuous source of mental trauma.
Just remember, if you hang in there long enough, good things can happen in this world.
However, when it comes to defeating the Matrix, Peter has other ideas. His angle is all about the money.
You have two options: unemployment or early retirement.
The concept of retirement is awfully paradoxical if you really think about it. Most workers treat it as the big carrot at the end of the 40-year-long stick, the wonderful reward of spending your dying days finally doing nothing. The problem is, to unlock the privilege of not working, you need a lot of money, which can only be obtained by working. Of course, when you finally notice the vicious cycle, the mind starts to wander towards those alternative ways of making money. Unfortunately, the world of business is already way ahead of us here. Any get-rich-quick scheme you hear about will invariably waste your time and effort to make someone else rich. A situation that's really no different from the job you're trying to circumvent in the first place. By this point, you may finally catch on to how most of the world actually makes money. The process basically comes down to taking stuff that's not yours. Traditionally, this is known as stealing. But throughout the history of commerce, it's been called many things, such as arbitrage, eminent domain, value extraction, and quantitative easing. For Peter's purposes, it's called justice.
And let's take enough money out of that place so that we never ever have to sit in a cubicle ever again.
Since Initech has stolen so much from him, it's only fair for him to steal from Initech. He hatches a plan and ropes in Michael and Samir to upload a computer virus to the company's mainframe. The program is designed to siphon off the extra decimal values of bank transactions and deposit them into a separate account. If left unnoticed, the scheme should net Peter and his buddies enough money so that none of them ever have to work again. While it may have been tempting to see our heroes ride off into the sunset with their bounty, that isn't what ends up happening. Michael messes up his math, and the virus ends up stealing so much money that it's instantly discovered. Peter and his friends are now in jeopardy of facing serious criminal charges. It's really demoralizing to see their scheme fail, but in many ways, this was the most fitting outcome. There's a lesson to be learned from Peter's quest for retribution. The more you chase after vengeance, the more you risk becoming the very thing you hate. Just like Initech, Peter exploited his friends for profit, and he ended up losing the one thing he really cared about.
You are a very bad person, Peter.
At the end of it all, he does the honorable thing and prepares to take the fall. But ultimately, Initech's fall doesn't come from Peter. It comes from the odd fellow who existed long before this story was written.
Here's that stapler I've been looking for here. Let me just go ahead and
get that from you.
Great.
Throughout the film, no worker gets treated worse than Milton. The bosses are constantly shuffling him around and ignoring his concerns. They won't even let him have his stapler. He's poorly socialized and has a hard time expressing himself, which in the corporate world makes him an easy target to pick up the slack. The most evil thing Initech does in the movie comes at Milton's expense. They essentially lay him off without telling him, fully intending to keep him busy until he figures out he's no longer employed.
So, Milton has been let go.
Well, just a second there, Professor. We fixed the glitch. So he won't be receiving a paycheck anymore, so it'll just work itself out naturally.
When it comes to early retirement, there is one other way to achieve it. Rather than removing yourself from the office, you can simply choose to remove the office. There comes a point when a man gets so disconnected from the rest of the world that they lash out at the very society around them. Most of the time, you never see it coming. When they get fed up enough, some folks just snap. Initech got a little too greedy, and in the end, Milton fixed the glitch. Human beings are designed to crave harmony, mobility, and autonomy. When you start depriving people of these bare necessities, our entire world falls out of balance.
Human beings were not meant to sit in little cubicles staring at computer screens all day, filling out useless forms and listening to 8 different bosses drone on about mission statements.
Modern man has mastered the complex and abandoned the simple. But for as far as we've strayed from our hunter-gatherer ancestors, we'll never outrun the natural laws that govern us both. You can disregard the past all you want, but it's hard to deny that those so-called miserable cavemen who spent their whole lives suffering are starting to sound a lot like us. And when you start treating people like cavemen, don't be surprised when they discover fire. Initech gets burned to the ground. All the evidence of the scheme is destroyed, and Milton ends up in a tropical paradise. Peter gets his own change of scenery, joining up with his roommate at a blue-collar construction job where he gets the pleasure of scooping up the rubble from his old office. At long last, he's finally found something he enjoys more than doing nothing. The ending of Office Space is still debated to this day. For a movie with such dark undertones, its cheerful resolution comes off a little too convenient for some. Mike Judge himself has expressed regret for how he should have handled the third act. Supposedly, there was an entirely different ending plan that never got implemented. Some have theorized that this may have involved Peter going to prison where he would literally get to do nothing all day, this time in a cell instead of a cubicle. Speculation of an alternate ending was further fueled by a particular line of dialogue that was removed from the final cut. In a deleted scene, a Lumbergh-like figure can be heard bossing Peter around during his last on-screen appearance.
Yeah, if you guys could just go ahead and sort of pick up the pace a little bit, that'd be great.
This small addition transforms the lasting impression of the film into something far more bleak. It implies that Peter's journey of self-discovery was completely pointless. Some prefer this version for being more true to life. After all, Who's to say that a construction site is any less exploitative than an office? Can anyone really escape the rat race? However, I've personally never been a fan of this darker ending. The whole thing makes Peter look like a fool and sort of undercuts the message of the entire plot that preceded it. Office Space has a lot to say about the nature of labor. That much is obvious. But the true meaning of the film has less to do with the system around us and more to do with how we as individuals fit into it. The realities of modern economics aren't going away anytime soon. Whatever change we seek has to come from within. Peter's construction job is empowering for the simple reason that he chose to do it. He gave up the hollow prestige of the white-collar lifestyle to do something that provides him with actual value. I feel like too many people in America have the wrong idea about value. The first mistake is believing that wealth is a measure of value, when really it's more often than not a supplement for value. The second mistake is believing that there's value to be found through hard work alone, and that toiling away in a miserable situation should be seen as some badge of honor. The combination of these two widely held ideals creates an environment which is utterly vacuous. There are plenty of reasons you can conjure up to justify why you go to work, but most of the ones we tell ourselves end up actively devaluing our lives. The moment we enter society, we're conditioned to have an adversarial relationship with what's supposed to be our main purpose in this world.
And Dale, remember, everyone likes a hard worker.
Of course they do. They do all the work for them!
I'm not trying to suggest that people are wrong for wanting to work for a living. What I'm saying is that many of us are working for the wrong reasons. Not enough people stop to consider what they really want out of life, whether all the treasures promised by the modern world are really worth the sacrifice. Human beings are not automatons. At some point, people have to feel like they're contributing to something beyond a mere financial transaction.
That's my only real motivation, is not to be hassled. That and the fear of losing my job, but you know, Bob, that'll only make someone work just hard enough not to get fired.
We have to see that the result of our labor is valuable, that it's beneficial to the people around us. Before you can like what you do, you have to be able to do what you like. I personally like the end of Office Space. It leaves us with a simple yet powerful lesson. There are certain things in life which are essential, the parts of ourselves that we can sell off but never buy back. These things are worth fighting for, no matter what the rest of society seems to tell you. We're all entitled to our own pursuit of happiness. If you don't look out for it, no one else will. Cultural commentators often like to claim that Office Space portrays an exaggerated version of the workplace, but I've never found that to be the case. I think the reason this film is so compelling is that it holds up a mirror to reality. It points out the true absurdities that most of us would prefer not to notice. Turns out that there are plenty of businesses around the world that are just like Initech. It's no exaggeration. The problem with Office Space is that it's too understated, because this work of fiction doesn't come close to the level of contempt that some real-life companies have for their workers.
We find it's always better to fire people on a Friday. Studies have statistically shown that there's less chance of an incident if you do it at the end of the week.
On the evening of Friday, December 10th, 2021, a violent tornado is barreling toward the town of Mayfield, Kentucky. The city happens to be home to a factory with roughly 110 employees. Their entire job is to manufacture scented candles, a totally superfluous accessory that could disappear from the world tomorrow without anyone really caring. Despite multiple tornado warnings throughout the day, the bosses at Mayfield Consumer Products have ordered the employees to keep working. As many would later claim, the company threatened to fire anyone who left their shift to flee the incoming storm. Even as tornado sirens start to go off around town, the people in charge still refuse to let anybody evacuate to safety. Moments later, the candle factory takes a direct hit from an EF4 twister, resulting in the deaths of 8 workers. I often wonder what must have gone through those employees' heads when they realized their fate, knowing that your final moments would be spent far away from your loved ones, toiling away making some expendable product that could just as easily cease to exist. only to realize that all along, the expendable product was you. I wonder how John Maynard Keynes would have reacted if he knew that this is where his grand economic vision of the future was headed. He wouldn't have predicted it, but he did get to experience it. Under the mounting exhaustion of rebuilding the world economy after the most destructive war in history, Keynes suffered a fatal heart attack at the age of 62. Many believe that he literally worked himself to death. In front of the Initech office, there's a generic corporate statue that literally depicts a square peg in a round hole. Sure enough, by some definition, it fits, but everything about it feels so intuitively wrong. A square is a very artificial shape. They don't really occur in nature. Square things only exist because we impose our own man-made desires on the environment around us. They stand in direct defiance of the cosmos, which prefers to make things round. We find ourselves today in a deeply unnatural world of our own creation, a long way off from those noble savages of our distant origins. Many people are fine with the modern world, and that's good for them. The appeal of office space is for everyone else who suspects that they don't quite fit into the rest of the equation. The year 2020 was a rough stretch for many people, but if there was one positive that came out of the whole thing, it's that many of us were finally forced to stop and think about what really matters. For the first time in ages, much of the workforce was given the rare opportunity to do nothing. All of a sudden, there was no longer the constant distraction of a society that insists on keeping us productive. In this brief window of time, people got a taste of life beyond work. They had to consider what was intrinsically valuable about their day-to-day experience. Many were shocked to see what little there was to be found. This small moment of clarity produced a great awakening, the effects of which we're still seeing to this day. Ever since the pandemic, there's been an unprecedented migration of white-collar workers away from the office. Many of them now work from home, a paradigm shift that most corporations have begrudgingly accepted as the new norm. Others have abandoned their old and unfulfilling careers entirely, moving on to new endeavors that grant them more agency over their lives. As a result of this mass exodus, a record number of offices are now sitting completely empty. The problem has become so dire that the commercial real estate market is close to the brink of collapse. Believe it or not, we may be approaching the literal end of office space. It appears that the days of depressing cubicles bathed in fluorescent lighting may soon become a thing of the past. There's a lot of disagreement in the modern world about labor, inequality, and economics. Most people don't tend to enjoy conversations about these issues, but they do enjoy watching Office Space. It's truly remarkable how Mike Judge was able to pull this off, but then again, maybe it was all part of the prophecy, where a man leaves his meaningless job to finally do something of value with his life. It's safe to say that after Mike Judge left the office, he certainly became much more valuable to the rest of the world. It'll probably take a very long time, but I suspect that one day, Office Space will emerge as the most influential film of 1999. It's such a strange thing to think about, because when we watch movies, we usually want to experience something spectacular and imaginative, a sort of escapist fantasy that allows us to leave our boring lives behind for a couple hours. You'd think that the last thing anyone would want from a movie is to be explicitly reminded of the unflattering reality we're trying to tune out in the first place. And yet, when it comes to Office Space, I can't think of another film that has had a greater effect on how I personally live my life today. It's good to take pride in what you do. Not enough people these days get to experience that feeling. If you happen to be someone who's struggling to find your place in the world, it's important to remember that you're not alone.
I don't know why I can't just go to work and be happy, like I'm supposed to, like everybody else.
Some would say that being chronically dissatisfied with life is now just business as usual. Finding your motivation isn't always easy. Sometimes it's buried deep inside of us. There's a million jobs out there I could have ended up with, but I ultimately chose what I do today for one simple reason. When people ask me about my work, I want to tell them that I can still have fun. And honestly, I don't know if I'd be able to say that if this unexpectedly profound piece of entertainment hadn't shown me the way. I'll always be grateful I crossed paths with it when I did, because there will never ever be another movie like it.